Morning. It's good to see you guys. You guys came out in such inclement weather, so thank you guys for roughing the water, so to speak. So my name is Tino Scott, and I am the presenter of the next story coming to you guys on History Detectives. So I want to give you some my brief history on the house, which is 618 Sherman, Southeast. 84, I moved into the house next door, which you can see adjacent to this. And I moved into the house as a sixth grader with my mother and brother. And when I moved into the house, my mom sat me down on the second day, and she says, "Son, listen to me." And her advice was stern, and I knew that she meant what she was saying. She said, "Son, don't ever go to 618. Don't ever go to that house. Don't knock on the door. Don't make any noise. Don't go in the yard. If a ball goes over the fence, leave it." So I said, "Mom, what's going on?" She says, "Well, the guy who lives in the house, he has a very, I would say, rough reputation. He's nothing to play with. He lives in the house alone, and more surprisingly, she said he's blind." And I was curious because I was like, "Well, man, he's living in a house, he's blind? This is crazy." And she says he's got guns all over the house, and if he's good at hearing, so if he hears anything and he gets scared, he's shooting first. So she says, "I love you dearly and I want to keep you around, so please heed my words." So I lived in the house for 2 years, from 84 to 86, and not once did I see an individual drive up to the home, knock on the door, come in or out. And I thought it was the most mysterious thing on earth. Like, this guy's living in a house, he's blind, he's by himself. What on earth is going on? But I didn't ask. And so that's my history of living next door to 618. And going forward, my brother Don, who's a church member of mine, and also a staff member of mine over at Madison Square Church, he says, "My daughter's buying a house, and the address is 618. I said, "Wow, I used to live at 616. He says, "Well, hey, my daughter's trying to get the house." I believe there was someone else who put a bid in, and it looked like that person was going to get the house, and his daughter wasn't. But what I told Don, I said, "Hey, if God's got your daughter's name on this house, you have nothing to worry about, it's hers, and I'm claiming it." Lo and behold, a couple days later, Don says, "The first guy, something happened. I don't know, he didn't get the deal. I think he was from New York, job opportunity fell through, and now my daughter is having a chance to get the house." And lo and behold, she got the house. So I would like to introduce the presenter, the man, my friend, a dear friend, my mentor, and the guy who's got me started out in genealogy and has been a great asset, source, and friend for me, Mr. Don Bryant.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. The mic is on. Is it loud enough? Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Tino. I really appreciate your help in the research of this and the actual witness accounts. It was really helpful. Your recollections remind me of a discussion I had recently, actually, with a Madison Square neighbor that lives up in the Madison Square neighborhood, who had personal encounters with Myles Woods, and that's the name of the person who lived in that house. Art recalled Officer Woods and police captain Walter Coe in the 1940s and 50s, and in fact remembered their patrol beat on the west side, southwest side of Grand Rapids. He told me Myles was very tall and had very large feet. And he said that over and over again. He had very large feet. And he emphasized that, and then Art was actually suspected of a petty larceny when he was young, of which he was innocent. And Officer Woods almost arrested him. But that experience seared into Art's memory, and that was a long time ago. House histories. I had the privilege to present here at History Detectives last year, and it was about Lawrence Earl, Grand Rapids' first artist. Was anybody here? Oh, wow. We got a lot of repeat people here today. The material for that program began with a house history. I wouldn't have even discovered him if I didn't research the house. My home in Heritage Hill, which is in the 200 block of Union, up near Cherry Street. I didn't talk about the house at all last year. It was all about who lived in the house. The Earl family. Lawrence Earl was the artist. Their lives, and especially Lawrence, and as a genealogist, that's the way I think. I'm wired. The four walls are pretty much, well, meaningless without some context of the people that lived in it. So why am I interested in 618 Sherman? First of all, it's because of the people who live in it. My daughter, Brittany, and my son-in-law, Troy, who are in Orlando right now. Hi, Britt. Hey, Troy. So here is Sherman Street in 1907. On the left is Union Avenue, and the James Street comes in from the north, right in the middle. Next is Henry Avenue, and then on the far right is Eastern. So that kind of gives you a feeling where we are, but this is 1907. This is Bro's subdivision. I mentioned the name Bro because it'll come up a little later in the discussion. And that is Butterfield subdivision. Butterfield subdivision was created in 1891. And to help you visualize this a little more, here is Heritage Hill, actually the southern part of it. And it's a black border there is the actual boundary of the historic district. So you can see my house up in the right is barely in the district. In fact, my back lot line is the border. And Sherman Street is barely out. That's pointing to where the house is at 618. Wealthy Street is almost exactly the halfway point between my house and Britt and Troy's house. 9-minute leisurely walk. And the South Hill neighborhood at the bottom, that borders Heritage Hill's southern end and sort of wraps around the bottom of Heritage Hill. This is the 1890 Polk map. And remember the Butterfield subdivision? That's right there. When that arrow is lot number 2. And that actually is where the 618 Sherman house was built years later. It really helps in your research if you know geography. So that's why I use maps and atlases. I think that's very important. There are many I've only shown you a couple, but there's many more resources up on the 4th floor, and I encourage you to don't miss those if you're doing any of this type of research. This house history actually starts with a church. And this was built in 1920, and it's on lot 1. So right next door, as we know, of the Sherman house. It began as a Berean Reformed church, which was a break-off of the Christian Reformed church. And the advertisement at the top describes 2 Sunday services, one in the morning that was in Dutch language, and one in the evening that was in English. And that was a common practice in these years with the Dutch churches. In 100 years, and that church building has been there 100 years this year, not much has changed at all. It's still a church, in fact, today. It's a Church of God denomination, but it's been a church almost the whole time. The first pastor was Henry Bonema from 1920 to 1929. It was he and his wife who became the first occupants of the parsonage next door. So 618 was the parsonage for the church. Fred Vanderweide was the second pastor and succeeded Henry, and he was resident from 1930 to 1935 in the parsonage. And we of course are quite familiar with the presence of the Dutch population in the Grand Rapids and West Michigan area. So there's no surprises here. The third pastor was Reverend Bert Baker. When I first saw this, it took me by surprise. How about you? He had a passion in his life. He had a collection of 1,000 hand-carved miniature figures, including circus wagons, animals, performers, and it had a name. It was Baker's Three-Ring Circus, and he actually displayed it in area shopping malls. Reverend Bert came to Grand Rapids about 1935 and lived in the parsonage at only a short time, probably just a year or so. And the Berean church was growing, and the congregation outgrew the building. And it was about this time that he guided the congregation to a church on Granville Avenue that was a larger facility. And the parsonage had been sold by 1936. So there's that same picture again. This photo is from the tax assessor's files, which confirm that the house was built in 1923. The church building in this time period was now empty, but it didn't go unused very long. The Crispus Attucks American Legion Post number 59, which is an African American Legion post, was quartered in the church building at 622 Sherman until 1939, which is when they got a new clubhouse downtown on Commerce. But Police Lieutenant Walter Coe was the actual post commander at this time. And in 1940, they relocated to Commerce, where it remained until 2006, and that building was razed. A Church of God congregation moved into the Sherman Street Church, being the first listed in the directories in 1940. This is a little rabbit trail, but this is Walter Coe. I've mentioned his name a couple times now. He came to Grand Rapids in 1916. He was a professional baseball player, and he was a good player, but he had other ambitions as well. In July 1922, Walter Coe became the first African American hired to the Grand Rapids Police Department. And that was 22, and he rose to rank of lieutenant in 1932, and eventually was the captain of the detective unit at the police department. And you may hear his name again today, just warning you. So who bought 618 Sherman? If you've read your brochure, you've probably guessed, and Tino actually gave you a good idea. But this is Myles L. Woods, Jr. Myles was born in 1906 in Grand Rapids. He went to Oakdale Elementary, then South High School. This is his graduation picture in 1924. Then he attended Grand Rapids Junior College and then University of Michigan. Coincidentally, the house is right around the corner from Gerald R. Ford boyhood home. And guess what? Gerald R. Ford didn't go to Oakdale, but he did go to South High School and attended junior college and went to U of M, famously. So I better put this on a different place. Okay, Myles is here in the top row, third from the left. He's the only African American in the Latin club at South High School. Again, this was 1924 from the yearbook. At the age of 18, now we're still about 1924, he was involved in an auto accident that fall. And the Grand Rapids Press reports all the news all the time. They name both drivers in each collision, but they don't mention who was at fault. Myles became a professional driver in the 1920s, so I doubt that was him that caused that particular accident. And in fact, he was a chauffeur, and from 1928 through 1933, he was a personal chauffeur for Frederick A. Wurzburg, the son of the founder of the Wurzburg department store. And then on August 14, 1933, at the age of 27, Myles became a policeman, a patrolman for the Grand Rapids Police Department. And of 258 applicants, only 70 passed the civil service examinations. Myles performed well enough to be among the final 17 new patrolmen. And for almost 25 years, Myles worked very closely with Walter Coe, and the two partnered up on a lot of things. And Walter ended up being his boss in the detectives division of the police department. Walter, when he was promoted to captain, he was the very first African American to become a captain in the department. 1933 was an important year for Myles for another reason, and it was the year he married his wife, Dorothy. In an interview Myles gave many years later, he explained that, quote, in those days, one couldn't get or hold a job unless he was married. So he made sure he was married his whole life. It wasn't necessarily the same wife the whole time, but we'll get into that. With the help of Captain Mark Ostapowicz at the police department, I was able to show you this photo of those exact same 17 new officers. Myles is in the front row, just to the right of center. And the police department did not record the date of this photo or for the reason, but I researched it and found it and connected it immediately with that newspaper article that I found. So this is probably September of 1933. Like his high school Latin class group shot, Myles is the only African American in his police training class. He developed a reputation in the police force as an enforcer, and when an unwelcome troublemaker was to be shown the way out of town, Myles was the guy to make sure it happened. That person got on the bus and never came back. And people who knew Myles invariably described him as very tall and broad-shouldered with an imposing stance, but it was only art that referenced his feet so often. Myles had a long career with the police department. He retired in 1966 after 33 years on the force. During his career, he was mentioned many times in the press. Here are just a sampling of the headlines. The Ghost concert, the Ghost concert actually happened right outside here. He was walking his beat, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, so very early morning hours, and he walked by the Fountain Street Church and heard the organ playing. And he looked, and there's no lights on. He just was he wasn't a suspicious person, but he definitely thought something was going on and checked into it. It gives all the detail there. I don't expect you to read that, but turns out it made the newspaper. Oh, sorry about that. This 1952 headline hints of a challenging period that Myles went through that year. He was dismissed from the police force by the city manager for alleged conduct unbecoming an officer. One of the people that testified at the hearing was Walter Coe, his boss at the time, actually. And although Myles's original attorney wasn't successful, his second attorney, Mr. David Amberg, got Myles reinstated. It was the same year, 1952, that Myles and his second wife divorced, and it was also the year he was diagnosed with glaucoma. Back in those days, there was no treatment known for glaucoma. But he continued to serve in the department several more years. He lived at 618 Sherman most of his life. He died in 1998, and the funeral service was held at the St. Philip's Episcopal Church, which is just a block and a half away from his house at the corner of Sherman and Henry. This is a photo of the house in 1998, so just after Myles, or 99, just after Myles' death. And as I mentioned, Myles had the glaucoma. In his later years, he became totally blind in one eye and could only see dark shadows in the other. As Tino mentioned in the introduction, Myles lived alone since that time in the 1980s. I believe family history of people should be part of any house history. House history is not complete without knowing the occupants. Vice versa, if you're a genealogist only and don't consider the local history, you're missing half the story too. So that's why I do that. Mom, Ida Mae, well, let's talk about Dad first. Dad is born in 1875 in Pike County, Mississippi. And Mom, Ida Mae, was born in Grand Haven, Michigan in 1878. For a picture of his family situation, Myles was the middle child of a total of 5 children. Dad, Myles Woods Sr., his story defies most stereotypes about what occupations and opportunities there was for African Americans coming north from places like Mississippi. Commonly held beliefs say that the only jobs available were as porters or barbers or employers like Pere Marquette Railroad. They were one of the largest employers in the area, and then the numerous hotels in Grand Rapids. But anytime I see an article about a death, and it's a full article and not just a simple obituary, I take notice, because this is someone in the community knew and respected. And reading the details, indeed, this is a different story than a lot of African Americans experienced. This is what's revealed. He died in a convalescence home, but his residence was listed at 709 Logan, which is a block and a half from 618 Sherman. Myles Sr. was a civil engineer. He was educated at Straight University in New Orleans and came to Michigan in 1899. Although at first he found work as a porter, he also was a janitor and later driver for a Muskegon candy company. But he was a watchman for the Luce Furniture Company and an engineer at Metal Office Furniture Company, which was today Steelcase. And in 1922, he went into home building for himself. And I also note on the article that he was a member of St. Philip's Episcopal Church. Mom, Ida Mae Smith, her obituary identifies her as Mrs. Myles L. Woods Sr., and then, quote, mother of city patrolman Myles L. Woods Jr., quote, unquote. He was that well known around town that his mother's obituary identifies him. She was one of the founding members of St. Philip's Episcopal Church. It's the other thing that we learned from this obituary. Ida Mae Smith was born in Grand Haven in 1878, and I wondered about that. I said, okay, how did this African-American family come to be there in Grand Haven, and when did they come? There must be a story. Well, Edmund Smith, who is Ida Mae's father, was brought to Grand Haven at the very end of the Civil War by Reverend William Ferry. He was born in slavery in Kentucky in 1827, and he was with General Grant at Vicksburg in 1863. Now, what is that? I don't know exactly, but my knowledge of the Civil War and what was happening there, he was probably an escaped slave, and contraband, with Abraham Lincoln making that a way for the slaves to get collected, but also to join the Union armies in helping them in their efforts. Well, Reverend William Ferry was a Methodist missionary at Mackinac Island in the early 1820s. Now that's early in Michigan. His children were all born on the island. He later was the founder of Grand Haven. That's how Edmund got to Grand Haven. Ferrysburg, of course, is named for the same family, but for one of his sons. He was married to Sarah Wallace, and that was 1870. She was, again, born into slavery in Virginia. She made her way in Detroit, and that's where they were married. Reverend Supply Chase is the person who performed the ceremony, and he was a very famous preacher in Michigan. And in Detroit, he was the pastor for the Second Baptist Church for decades. He was also an abolitionist. Ida Mae's older brother. This guy could do a presentation all by himself. That's it. It's fascinating. He was quite famous in West Michigan. He was Uncle Ed to Myles, as his Myles's mother's brother. He was also commonly known as Blind Ed. This photo is Edward Smith Monument Park, 1928, and we got that right up here in the archives. It's also appeared in other publications in the context of the Depression in the early 1930s, but we know 1928 is not the Depression. That's the Roaring '20s. So Ed Smith had his own reality as a blind man in the Roaring '20s, but he's making his way through life, and he's selling newspapers and pencils on the streets of Grand Rapids. He did that in Grand Haven, too, when he lived there. Backing up to Grand Haven a little bit, he was born in 1873, and he was blind by the age of 10. So, and then he became despondent as a young adult, and he attempted suicide by laying across the train tracks in Grand Haven. He was rescued by police who were alerted by Ed's friends. And additionally, he once walked to Grand Rapids by himself. So, wow. He moved to Grand Rapids about 1900 and lived with his sister. He kept in contact and was back and forth to Grand Haven a few times. But blind Ed, so it might be possible that Myles Jr. became blind because of his genetic background in his family, his mother's family. Myles, too, must have inherited strong character because they both had that. Like Myles, Ed was written up several times in the newspapers. Phonograph mimic, that's from 1924. I had to read this over and over again, and I still don't get it. He's on a street corner, and it's an advertising somehow they're referencing in the article. And then the blind man's coat is fired. That was 1931. He was mugged, and it was up on Franklin Street. And unfortunately, that was not the only time he was mistreated and taken advantage of because of his being blind. The portrait in 1936, he was a subject, he was very popular. A lot of people knew him because he's out on the streets all the time in Grand Rapids. Reinhold Weidenauer chose him and made a portrait of him. And Reinhold was, I don't know if you know his name, but I'll tell you how to learn more about him in a minute. But he was only 20 years old, so he was just starting his career. Upstairs on the 4th floor, there's the biographical vertical files. You can check his out, and you can see exactly the kind of work he did. And if you walk through the Amway Grand Plaza, there's paintings and etchings up there in the elevator areas. But here's the kicker. For me, this is a real window into Ed's personality. By blind driver, horse has been steered all about town, okay? Edward Smith, Negro newspaper seller, in court for disorderly conduct. Ed was credited in the court case newspaper article, quote, "The most peculiar disposition of any man in Grand Rapids has developed ability in a line that has never before been attempted by persons who have not the use of their eyes." And in short, Ed had been driving a horse about the streets of Grand Rapids for several weeks, and he was only found out while driving down Monroe Street, and the runner of his sleigh caught in the streetcar track and upset the cart. Now the police were notified, and so that's how he got caught. Hence his arrest, subsequent court appearance. That was disorderly conduct. Now, short story here, the judge was pretty firm with Ed and admonished him not to repeat his actions, but the judge did let him off in the end because he was blind. Some details we know, and other details are revealed in this article. And again, it's not a regular obituary, so it has additional information because he was well known. In fact, it says he's known to thousands. And he attended Lansing Industrial School for the Blind. He learned to read Braille, recently spends hours at home making toys or little tables, listening to his phonograph. And there might be a clue to that phonograph needle instant. He took walks daily, and in recent years he traveled alone to other cities. He learned how to do that years ago, and he was a member of the St. Philip's Episcopal Church. Speaking of St. Philip's Episcopal Church, you've heard that mentioned several times already. Of the Smith family, Ida Mae, Myles's mother, and his aunt, whose name was Bernice, were two of the 8 founding members of St. Philip's Church. 8 was the number of black Episcopalians there were in Grand Rapids in 1911. So those 8 were advised by the bishop to circulate petitions to recruit more members, friends, and neighbors, enough to convince him to start a church. They succeeded, and that church began in 1911, and the first several years they met in the basement of the Odd Fellows Hall, which is on the west side of Henry near Sherman. The building effort soon began in fundraising, and in 1923 they built this structure. Mr. and Mrs. George M. Smith were members of the church. Mr. Smith was the publisher of the first African-American newspaper in Michigan. Not just Grand Rapids, in Michigan. And it was called the Michigan State News. George was the principal driver of that church building committee. And there was another person, Stanley Barnett, who was advertised in the 40th anniversary book that I found some of this information. He had a hotel down on Commerce Street, and it's, I think the Cooley Law School is at that address now. But George Smith and Stanley Barnett were two of the original founders of the local chapter of the NAACP. They actually partnered way before it was formed and had local organizations that had the same purpose, but then they associated with NAACP. This presentation is not intended to be a history of the church. It just popped up all the time. Everything I came across pointed back to this. And on this, I hesitate to list a name like this because I'm sure to miss many others. This is not all inclusive. There's probably no limit to how many connections would be found if you really went into it. But other members of the church over the years that need mention, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Clater. Dr. Robert Clater was the first African-American doctor in Grand Rapids, and he also was the first African-American doctor to be hired on staff at a hospital. And in fact, he was hired by 2 hospitals at the same time. His wife, Helen, would become the first black president of National YWCA. And Milo Brown, that's the Brown Funeral Home. Now it's Brown Hutcherson, it's on Jefferson. Mr. and Mrs. Floyd Skinner. Floyd was the first African-American attorney in Grand Rapids. And then also mentioned Stanley and Walter Coe. Walter Coe's wife, Ethel, was actually a niece of Stanley. So you can see how tight these connections are. Shifting gears, now I want to tell you about Myles' wives. He married a total of 4 times. Since we have a certain amount of time here today, I'm going to focus on his first wife and third wife. Dorothy Moore was also known as, usually known as Mrs. Dorothy Woods, Mrs. Myles Woods, Mrs. D.M. Woods, and so on. So it took me a while to find her maiden name. It was a challenge, but did it. She lived in the Earl House on Union she was a maid in the directory. She was age 17. And then that was 1919. And as a stenographer in 1922, she's in the same house. She's likely employed by the Earl family from 1920 and 21 as well. Wait, this is my house. What are the chances of that? It's a merger of two house history researches here. I would never have found that if I hadn't done my own house history. Dorothy personally knew artist Lawrence Earl and his sister Kate. Anyways, wrap your head around that. So one of Dorothy's first employers was the Early family, if not the first employer. In 1922, she gave her employer as the Michigan State News. Remember Mr. George Smith? She was now a stenographer, and she worked for that newspaper. And that Michigan State News was already becoming the voice of the NAACP in Michigan. Dorothy was there at the very beginning. This article connects Dorothy and St. Philip's Church to that early NAACP chapter. Reverend Jesse Anderson, the rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church, is elected president of the chapter, and Mrs. Myles Woods, Jr., elected as the assistant secretary. And that's 1940. Here's one of those informative articles that tell so much more than a typical obituary. It actually details the beginnings of the Grand Rapids Urban League. Maud Bro inherited a lot of money. Her father and her brother were very, very successful in lumbering, and they both died and left her as the sole heir in both their estates. She was a very generous philanthropist from then on. She lived part of the time in the Oakwood apartments on Cherry Street, but her family registered that Borough subdivision that I mentioned earlier, and that's at the corner of James and Logan, so right in the same neighborhood. She definitely had an interest. She donated $12,000 in 1942 to purchase property on Henry Avenue, just adjacent to the St. Philip's Church. And it was given through the Borough Community Association, which was formed in 1943. In 1943, Dorothy joined the staff of the Borough Community Association as administrative secretary, which later became the Grand Rapids Urban League. Dorothy was there at the very beginning. And in 1955, the National Urban League had an award that was for Mrs. D.M. Woods, and she was honored nationally. The Telegraph says, "Hearty congratulations on selection as Urban League Secretary of the Year," and signed Ruth Allen King, President of the National Urban League. And this particular article is when I finally figured out that her maiden name was Moore. And the others in this photo, David Amberg on the left is the Urban League board president, basically. And remember Myles' rough year in 1952? Mr. Amberg was instrumental in getting him reinstated in the police department. I gather Dorothy may have been involved in that connection. After all, it's about who you know. And the gentleman on the right is Paul I. Phillips, and he was executive secretary of the Urban League. And Dorothy was his assistant for many, many years. And this was so important to the Urban League that they created a Dorothy Woods Staff Excellence Award in her name. And it's been awarded as recently as 2016 to the current chief operating officer, who's Brenda Moore, and the Moore name is not connected to Dorothy, but that's still being given out. Now Rita, this is Rita V. Hall, that's her maiden name, and it took a while to figure that out, but This was Myles' third wife. Myles and Rita married in 1960. Myles was age 54, Rita age 45. She'd likely never lived at 618 Sherman, because when she and Myles married, they moved and lived into her family home, which was right around the corner on Logan Street. During the 60s until 71, the occupants at Sherman Street were renters. One of them was a guy named Donald Moore. Again, there's no connection, it's just a common name. My stepmother's name is Moore too. Anyways, he was a manager at a Meijer store. I think it may have been the one on Kalamazoo, which isn't there anymore, but am I on time here? Okay. I'm almost done. Her obituary might as well have been a newspaper page in itself. It's beautiful. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's a lot of things you learn about Rita. She spent most of her life in Grand Rapids, one of the first black women to own her own business in the 40s and 50s. That was Kelly's Dry Cleaners. The first black woman to become a department manager at Herpelsheimer's, which at the time was the largest department store in West Michigan. She took a job as a forest ranger in Baldwin for the U.S. Forest Service, and that was in the 70s. And she was awarded for her service as being the oldest female working in their Older Americans program. Her final job was at the Paul Collins Gallery at the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel. Her first husband was a Collins. Her children include Paul, the artist in Grand Rapids. Everybody hear of him? There was much more in that article, but here's a color version of the photo. And it's way more than just a picture. It's literally a work of art created by her son, Paul Collins. Switching gears again, and this is going to be quick. This is the Carew family. This is Adelaide and Carew. Cops is the short nickname for Coppins. And they were a prolific song and dance duo, especially popular in the 30s. Cops had studied under Bill Robinson, AKA Bojangles. Then he taught his wife, Adelaide, and they were very good. They were on Mississippi showboats, venues throughout the Midwest. In Grand Rapids, they were featured regularly at a Club Seville, which was in Madison Square. But among other things, Coppins Carew was a golfer, a farmer. He boarded horses. They had a family farm near Lowell. And actually, they came there to vacation from working on the road. And that's how they got connected with the Lowell showboat, which they did frequently. Then they moved to Grand Rapids before 1940, and they resided on Henry, right around the corner, very near Sherman Street. Benny was Coppins' brother. Benny Carew, when I first looked at this and I started Google searching, I came up with a hit on history detectives. That's because last year he was mentioned in Chris Byron's program on hot spots in a cool city, if you remember that one, the evening entertainment spots in Grand Rapids. The other search hits I got on Google were successful musicians from all over who included, quote, played with Benny Carew, unquote. And that was going to enhance their resumes, make them legitimate. So Benny Carew meets Bobby Charles Quartet. That is a recording, and it's a very rare, because Benny didn't do a lot of recording. But I chose that because my son-in-law, Troy, how you doing? His birthday was last June, and I got this and gave it to him. But this is before they had moved into their house. I had done a lot of the research, and I discovered that Benny Carew lived there. And so when he read the history that I wrote up for them, he got to that point. He says, "Benny Carew in our house?" This thing is pretty hot. Anyways, the story ends with a church. Of course, it's St. Philip's. Myles was interviewed by Gerald Elliott in 1982, and there's one quote that was very cool. "Most persons who meet Myles are impressed with his knowledge of the history of Grand Rapids. He has been called a walking, talking history of the town." How cool is this? He was both a detective and a historian. All right. In the closing of his article, he's, although still a member of St. Philip's, where he used to sing in the choir while his sister Sarah was playing the organ, he rarely gets to church anymore. A deeply religious man, he listens to church services on the radio, and in this, he is non-denominational. If the preacher is good, he doesn't care what church he represents. "I get a lot out of religion," he says simply. The fact is, despite his great handicap, Myles Woods still gets a lot out of life. At the moment, he is thinking of writing a book. Speaking of books, there are two that I highly recommend. If you haven't read them, I would suggest it if you want to get interested in more information, especially about the background in Grand Rapids with the struggle on the civil rights. Randall Jelk's book came out in 2006, and City Within a City came out in 2013. Todd Robinson, I was in the room when he was standing right here talking about his new book, and that was 7 years ago now, but highly recommended. And I don't know, do we have time for questions? Okay. And we're going to definitely want to get those. Thank you. Thank you. And we'll definitely want to get the questions on recording so Britt and Troy can hear them. Who's got the microphone? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm curious how Myles went from being really well known to living alone and no one goes in and out of his house. What happened there?
I couldn't guess. Just because he was blind, I'm sure that limited his mobility of getting around places, although when Tino mentioned that was a particular point in time in the 80s. Doesn't mean he was always there. We could have other witnesses that can help substantiate that.
So a common problem people say when researching African American history is lack of sources, and it sounds like you kind of had a jackpot with some well-known figures, but did you encounter that at all, where there was answers you wanted but couldn't find because of lack of sources?
I didn't get all the way deep into all the families. For instance, in Mississippi, I could not find any more about Myles Sr. as far as his parentage, but I found his siblings. And there was two of his brothers who also were in New Orleans, and they lived there for quite a while. One thing I noted is everybody in that Woods family, all the siblings and cousins, they all owned their house. And so that kind of tradition leads me to believe that Myles Sr., that's kind of why he built houses. It was a very important part of their family tradition.
Hi, I'm sorry. I was actually, the source information concerning 622 Sherman, where did you find that? That was actually my family church, the 60s through the 80s.
Really?
It was Sherman Street Church of God in
Okay.
Christ. And I spent a lot of time
the pictures there came from the City Archives. In 1936, the tax assessor went through the whole city of Grand Rapids and recorded it. At that time, that church was, I think it was owned by the Old Kent Bank, which was very common in the middle of the Depression. In fact, the Woods house was also owned by Old Kent Bank, with Myles as having a land contract with it, and he eventually paid that off. But there's a bunch of sources, and I'd be happy to share them with you afterwards if you want.
Okay, thanks, Don.
Yep.